The sun beat down hard on the red earth, the kind of heat that baked the truth right out of a man. Sawyer Whitlow felt it on his neck as he urged his gelding up the narrow ridge trail, dust kicking up behind him like a ghost giving chase. He hadn't meant to ride this far west, but the silence of his own land had started to feel too loud, and he was chasing a quiet he couldn't find. He'd spent too many years riding alone, the ache of it settling deep in his bones. He rounded a sharp bend in the trail, his eyes scanning the sun-blasted stretch of dirt and scrub ahead. And that was when he saw her. She was just standing there, a dead stop in the middle of nowhere. A woman. Her dress was ripped at the hem, caked with the same red dust his horse was kicking up. Her hair was a mess, stuck to her face with sweat. She was holding a baby, holding it so tight it seemed like she was the only thing keeping the child from blowing away on the hot breeze. Her whole body was slumped, like a marionette with its strings cut, ready to collapse into the earth. The baby itself, no more than a few months old, was flushed and still. Dangerously still. Sawyer did what any man trying to mind his own business would do. He rode right past her. Just a few paces. He kept his eyes forward, his jaw tight. This wasn't his trouble. He had fences to mend, cattle to check, a life that was already full of its own empty spaces. He didn't need to take on anyone else's. But he couldn't shake the image of her. Standing there like a scarecrow meant to frighten off hope itself, like she'd already been told no by the entire world and was just waiting for the dirt to say it too. He pulled on the reins, the leather groaning in protest. He turned the horse around. "You all right, madam?" His voice was low, rough from disuse. The woman blinked, her eyes focusing on him as if he'd just materialized from the heat haze. Her lips were cracked, her skin a painful-looking red under a layer of grime. "No," she whispered, the word barely a puff of air. "I am not." In a second, he was off his horse, tying the reins to a gnarled mesquite branch. "You hurt?" She shook her head. The movement was slow, exhausted. "Just tired. Been walking since yesterday. My baby. Her name is Hope. She's hot. She needs water." Sawyer didn't hesitate. He grabbed the canteen from his saddlebag and held it out. Her hands trembled as she took it, her fingers brushing his. She was so careful, tilting the metal spout to the baby's lips. The little one stirred, suckled for a moment with a weak, desperate energy, and then let out a tiny whimper that tore right through the quiet. "I'm Sawyer Whitlow," he said, crouching down to get a better look at them. "Where are you headed?" She took a long, shaky breath, her gaze drifting out over the unforgiving landscape. "I don't know. I was just getting away from where I was." He looked at her shoes, worn through at the soles. He looked at the way she cradled that baby, like it was her anchor in a world that was trying to sweep her away. There was a story here, a hard one. "You got a name?" he asked gently. "Geneva," she said. "Geneva Finch." Sawyer gave a single, decisive nod. "All right, Geneva Finch. You're not walking another step." He stood and offered her his hand. She looked at it for a long second, a flicker of mistrust in her eyes, before she reached out and took it. Her grip was surprisingly strong. He helped her onto his horse, her body so light she felt like a bird. Then he swung up behind her, his presence a steady wall at her back. The baby, Hope, was nestled between them. Geneva leaned back against his chest, a sigh of pure exhaustion escaping her lips. For a long while, the only sound was the clop of the horse's hooves on the baked earth. The sun began to dip, painting the sky in angry strokes of orange and purple. The shadows grew long and distorted, like secrets stretching out from the landscape. "Where are you taking me?" she finally asked, her voice muffled against his shirt. "My place. It's a ways out. But it's quiet. It's safe. You and your girl can rest there." She nodded, but he could feel the tension in her spine. "You don't have to do this." "Maybe not," he said, his voice a low rumble she could feel in her bones. "But I'm going to." When they finally arrived at his homestead, a simple wooden house with a tin roof, surrounded by 20 acres of rough pasture, Geneva stared at it like it was a palace. He got them inside, sat her on the edge of his bed, and brought her a dipper of cool water and a clean cloth. As Geneva gently unwrapped the baby's thick shawl, Sawyer noticed something. Tucked into the folds of the fabric was a small silver rattle. It was ornate, finely crafted, with delicate engravings that caught the fading light. It looked expensive, far too expensive for a woman walking a dusty trail with holes in her shoes. He didn't say anything. He just watched. "You live here alone?" she asked, her eyes tracing the sparse lines of the room. "I do," he said, his gaze flicking from the rattle back to her face. "Had a brother. Died in the war. My folks were gone before that. It's just been me." She accepted this without comment, her expression giving nothing away. He could see the weariness etched so deep into her it looked like it was part of her soul. "I'll fix us something to eat," he offered, turning away. "Thank you, Sawyer." He met her eyes, and for the first time he saw something other than fear or exhaustion. It was a guarded, calculating watchfulness. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need, Geneva." She looked away fast, but not before he saw her swallow hard. This wasn't a woman used to kindness. Or maybe she was a woman who knew that kindness always came with a price. That night, she and the baby slept in his bed. Sawyer took the worn armchair by the cold fireplace. He told himself he was just keeping watch, making sure the fire didn't spring back to life. But really he was watching her. The soft rise and fall of her breath. The way her hand rested protectively on the baby's back even in sleep. She was a complete stranger, but something about her felt like a question he was suddenly desperate to answer. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't just letting her walk back out that door, not after he'd turned around, and not after he'd seen that flash of silver hidden in the folds of a poor woman's shawl. The fire was nothing but gray ash by the time Sawyer shifted in the armchair, his neck stiff. Morning light, thin and pale, was just beginning to slice through the gaps in the curtains. Geneva hadn't moved an inch, her arm curled around the baby, a silent guardian. He stood up, his joints popping in the quiet room, and stepped out onto the porch. The air was cool and sharp, carrying the scent of dew and dust. A couple of crows were having a loud disagreement in the mesquite tree out front. He pulled a bucket of water from the rain barrel and went back inside to get the stove going. The clank of the iron door must have stirred her. When he glanced over his shoulder, she was sitting up in bed. Her hair was a wild tangle around her face, but her eyes were clear and sharp. They were fixed on him. "I didn't mean to sleep so long," she said, her voice husky. "You needed it," he replied, not looking at her as he set a tin pot of water on the heat. Geneva leaned back, adjusting the sleeping baby. "I should find work," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "You just got here. I don't live off other people's kindness." Her tone was flat, final. "I can sew, mend things. I can keep a house." He turned then, the pot of water forgotten. He met her gaze across the small room. There was a pride in her, hard as granite. "There's a loom up in the loft. It was my mother's. She used to weave to make ends meet." Her eyes stayed on his face for a beat too long, searching for something. Then she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Thank you." They ate in a tense silence. Cornbread and beans. Simple fare. Geneva carefully fed the baby some mashed sweet potato he'd found in the root cellar. The little girl, Hope, ate slowly, but with a steady determination that mirrored the woman holding her. That afternoon, Sawyer went out to mend the fence on the north pasture. When he left, Geneva was sitting under the big cottonwood tree near the house, the baby asleep in a makeshift cradle at her feet. She was carding some old wool he'd had stored away, her hands moving with a quick, practiced efficiency that was mesmerizing to watch. Her focus was absolute. It wasn't the posture of a woman simply passing the time. It was the posture of a woman building a wall, one thread at a time. He worked until dusk, his hands raw from the wire and his arms scratched by thorns. As he walked back toward the house, he saw her still sitting there, a still figure in the growing shadows. The setting sun caught the edges of her hair, turning it to fire. It was a peaceful scene, a woman, a baby, a home. But it felt wrong. It felt like a stage play, and he didn't know his lines. He stopped a few feet away, not wanting to break the spell. She looked up, as if she'd sensed him there all along. "The baby barely cried today." "Good sign," he said, his voice rough. "She's getting her strength back." Geneva tucked a stray piece of hair behind her ear. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "She's a fighter." He stepped closer, nodding at the wool in her lap. "You're good at that." "My aunt taught me," she said, her eyes on her work. "Taught me to card and spin before I could even read. Said it was the only way to keep my hands from shaking." "What happened to your aunt?" Her hands stilled for a fraction of a second. "She got left behind. My mother died when I was born. Aunt Ruth took me in, but she was never right after her husband didn't come back from the war." The story was smooth, a little too smooth. He crouched down, pretending to check on the sleeping baby. "Anyone after that?" Geneva looked away, toward the darkening ridge. "I married a man. He needed a cook more than a wife. He died last month. A saloon fight in San Saba. Left me with nothing but his debts." Sawyer's jaw tightened. He'd heard of the fights in San Saba. They were brutal, ugly affairs. But her story felt rehearsed, like a garment she'd patched together from scraps. He stood up, the silence stretching between them. "You plan on staying?" Her head snapped back toward him, her eyes wide with a sudden, raw panic. I don't know yet, but I don't want to go." She was afraid of the question. He nodded slowly, then held out his hand. "Come on. Help me bring in the goats. They wander when it gets dark." She hesitated, then placed her hand in his. Her skin was cool. They walked toward the slope behind the barn, their footsteps falling into an easy rhythm. The baby was safe in the house, the door left open just a crack. Geneva moved with a quiet confidence, herding the stubborn animals as if she'd been doing it her whole life. Once the goats were penned, they leaned against the fence, watching the last sliver of sun disappear. The world seemed to hold its breath. "It's strange," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "To feel safe." Sawyer didn't answer right away. He just looked at her profile, silhouetted against the bruised purple sky. "You are safe here," he said. The words felt true and like a lie all at once. She turned to face him, her eyes searching his in the dim light. "Why did you stop for me on that trail, Sawyer?" He looked out over his land, the land that had been his whole world until yesterday. "I don't rightly know, but when I saw you, I knew if I rode on, I'd be riding away from something important. I couldn't do it." She didn't speak, but he saw it. A tiny crack in her armor, a softening around her eyes. Something was changing between them, shifting like the shadows around their feet. As they walked back to the small, warm square of light that was the house, her hand brushed against his. It was a fleeting touch, barely there, but it sent a jolt through him. She didn't pull away. And in that moment, Sawyer knew he was in deep. Deeper than he'd been in his whole life. He was falling for a woman whose past was a locked room, and he was beginning to suspect that whatever was inside was dark and dangerous and coming for her. The rains came in early May, not a deluge, but a series of soft gray showers that settled the dust and brought the sharp, clean scent of cedar through the open windows. Geneva had fallen into a rhythm, rising before the sun to sweep the porch, her movements quiet and efficient. She kept the baby, Hope, tied to her chest in a sling, a constant warm weight against her heart. Her hands were always busy, mending, cooking, weaving, but her eyes were not. Her eyes were always watching the trail that snaked over the distant ridge, watching Sawyer as he moved across the yard, his shoulders broad and his stride purposeful. One morning, he found her by the woodpile, wrestling with a dull hatchet, trying to split kindling. Sweat beaded on her temples, her jaw set in a line of pure, stubborn frustration. "You'll hurt yourself," he said, his voice making her jump. He gently took the hatchet from her hand. It wasn't a request. She stepped back, wiping her dusty palms on her skirt. "I've done harder chores." "Still," he said, testing the blunted edge with his thumb. "This one's mine." She didn't fight him on it. She just bent down to gather the pieces she'd managed to split. As she stood up, she looked at him, a strange glint in her eye. "You always this sure about what's yours?" He met her gaze, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Only when it matters." The air between them crackled. That afternoon he hitched the wagon. He was going to town for supplies. Geneva hadn't said a word, but he'd seen her measuring out the flour, making every grain count. He'd seen her using the soap until it was a transparent sliver. He just nodded toward the wagon seat. "Come on." She strapped Hope into the sling, her face unreadable, and climbed up beside him. The ride to the town of Mason was bumpy, the wagon wheels lurching in the dried ruts of the road. Geneva sat straight-backed, her arm a protective barrier around the baby. As they entered the small town, she seemed to shrink. Her eyes darted toward every person they passed, every shadow in every alleyway. On the boardwalk, two dusty-looking men stopped their conversation to stare at her. They stared a little too long, a little too hard. Sawyer turned his head and fixed them with a cold, flat look until they shuffled away. Inside the dry goods store, the air was thick with the smell of coffee beans and bolts of cloth. Geneva ran her fingers over a length of blue calico, her touch feather light, but she didn't ask for it. Sawyer gathered what they needed: sugar, salt, flour. "See anything you want?" he asked, his voice low. She paused by a display of sewing notions, her eyes landing on a small packet of needles. "I don't need much." "That wasn't the question I asked, Geneva." She looked up at him then, and in her eyes he saw a deep, heartbreaking longing. "Maybe just a needle," she whispered. "One that won't snap." He added it to his pile without a word. As they were loading their supplies back into the wagon, a woman approached them. She was dressed in a stiff, pristine dress, her hat perfectly placed. She looked at Sawyer, then her gaze slid to Geneva, her eyes narrowing in a quick, dismissive appraisal. "Mr. Whitlow," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "we missed you at the spring social." "Don't go in for socials, Miss Carroll," Sawyer said, his tone clipped. Miss Carroll's smile was all teeth. She turned her full attention to Geneva. "And who is this?" Geneva's spine stiffened. She pulled the baby closer. "Geneva Finch." "A pleasure," Miss Carroll said, though her eyes said otherwise. "Staying out at the Whitlow place, are you?" "For now," Geneva said, her voice even. "Well," the woman sniffed, "I suppose everyone needs a bit of charity now and then." She turned on her heel and walked away, leaving a trail of smug satisfaction in her wake. Sawyer's jaw was a hard, angry line. "Don't you mind her?" "I don't," Geneva said, her voice tight. "But she's not wrong. I am depending on you." He finished tying down the canvas cover and climbed up onto the seat beside her. He didn't look at her. He looked out at the dusty street, at the three boys chasing a dog near the livery stable. "You think that bothers me, Geneva?" "I don't know what you feel." He turned his head then, his eyes locking with hers. They were dark, intense. "It makes me feel like I've been a fool for pretending I was happy being alone." Geneva said nothing. She just stared at him, her breath caught in her throat. A breeze kicked up, lifting a strand of her hair and making the baby stir. They rode home in silence, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was filled with the things they hadn't said. The sun was setting at their backs, stretching the wagon's shadow out long in front of them, like it was leading them toward an unknown future. As the miles passed, Geneva leaned back, her hand resting on the wooden seat between them. Sawyer's hand found hers. His fingers brushed against her knuckles, a slow, deliberate touch. She didn't pull away. He laced his fingers through hers. Some things didn't need words. Some things were decided on a dusty road, with the setting sun as a witness. But as he held her hand, Sawyer felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He was tying himself to a woman who was running from something, and he had a terrible feeling that whatever it was running right toward them. Behind the smokehouse, choked by weeds and neglect, was the ghost of a garden. A few crooked stakes, tangled with the brown, brittle remains of last year's vines. Geneva stood there for a long time, Hope balanced on her hip, the baby tugging at her collar. She crouched down, crumbling the dry soil between her fingers. It was thirsty, but it wasn't dead. There was life here, buried and waiting. The next morning, she was out there at sunrise, a rusty hoe in her hand, her movements fierce and determined. Sawyer watched her from the barn. He didn't say a word, just filled a pail with water from the well and set it by the garden gate. She was trying to put down roots. He wasn't sure if he should be relieved or terrified. Later that day, he came back with a few small sacks, seeds, beans, onions, squash. He set them down beside the water pail. He didn't say where he got them. She didn't ask. "You ever plant before?" she asked, not looking at him as she wiped the sweat from her brow. "Just enough to keep the goats happy." "I'll need to know where the well water runs," she said, her voice businesslike. "If I dig too deep near the vein, the ground will go soft." He pointed with his chin toward a tall ash tree at the edge of the property. "Water runs shallow to the west of that tree. You'll know it when you hit it. The soil gets cool." She nodded. "I'll start there." He didn't leave. He leaned against the rough wood of the shed, his arms crossed over his chest, and just watched her. He watched her gently lay Hope on a blanket in the shade of the fence. He watched the methodical way she cleared the weeds, her body moving with a strength that surprised him. "You ever think about leaving here?" she asked suddenly, her back still to him. The question hung in the air, heavy and sharp. "I did once," he admitted. "Went all the way to Abilene. Thought I'd just keep going, head up to the rail towns in Kansas, but I ended up working on a ranch for 2 years. After a while, this place started to feel like home again." "Why'd you come back?" He hesitated. He hadn't told anyone this. "My mother's wedding ring. She buried it for safekeeping during the war right behind the barn. I couldn't just leave it in the dirt." Geneva stopped working. She turned around slowly, her face smudged with dirt, her expression unreadable. "You ever think about giving it to someone?" The question was quiet, but it landed like a thunderclap. "I used to," he said, his voice rough. "But I never met a woman who looked me in the eye and stayed." She stood up, brushing the dirt from her skirt. She walked toward him, stopping just a few feet away. She looked him right in the eye. "I'm staying." His breath caught. "I know," he said, and it was the truest thing he'd ever said. That night the wind changed. It carried the scent of rain and something else, something like a promise. They sat on the porch steps as darkness fell, Hope sleeping soundly in a basket at their feet. Sawyer had a tin cup of chicory, and he passed it to her. She took a sip, the warmth spreading through her. "You never asked how old I was," she said, staring out at the sea of stars that was beginning to appear. "Figured you'd tell me if it mattered." "I turned 23 last month." He nodded. "I'm 35. She took another sip of the chicory. "You don't seem like a man who's wasted his time." "Maybe I'm just tired of waiting," he said softly. "Tired of waiting for a reason to stop being alone." She turned to him then, her face serious in the pale moonlight. "I wasn't sure I could ever want anything again," she said, her voice so low he had to lean in to hear it. Not after everything. But I want this, Sawyer. This place. This quiet." "You sure, Geneva?" She nodded, her gaze unwavering. "I don't say things I don't mean." He didn't touch her, not yet, but the space between them was electric. "Then we'll build it," he said, slow and steady. "The right way." She reached out and covered his hand with hers. Her skin was calloused from her work in the garden, but it was warm, so warm. They sat there for a long time, not speaking, their hands clasped together. The porch creaked. The baby sighed in her sleep. Far off on the ridge, a lone coyote called out to the moon. Sawyer looked at Geneva, at the determined set of her jaw and the strength in her eyes, and he felt a powerful, fierce wave of protectiveness wash over him. He would build a life with this woman. He would keep her safe. But a cold voice in the back of his mind whispered a chilling question. What if the thing he needed to protect her from was the truth? A few weeks later, something happened that shattered their fragile peace. Sawyer had to ride to Fredericksburg for supplies they couldn't get in Mason, a new blade for the plow, some real coffee, and the bolt of muslin she'd shyly asked for to make a warmer gown for Hope. It was a 2-day ride, and he hated leaving them alone. But it had to be done. He left at dawn, with her promise to keep the shotgun loaded and the door barred at night. He pushed his horse hard, the feeling of unease riding on his shoulder like a vulture. In Fredericksburg, a bigger, busier town, he took care of his errands quickly. As he was leaving the mercantile, a piece of paper tacked to the community notice board caught his eye. It was a wanted poster. He'd seen hundreds of them in his life, but this one made the blood freeze in his veins. It was for a man named Jedediah Finch, wanted for the robbery of a stagecoach near San Saba, for the murder of the driver and 2 passengers. The reward was a staggering $500, but it wasn't the name or the crime that stopped his heart. It was the face, a crudely drawn but unmistakable likeness of a man with cold, empty eyes and a cruel twist to his mouth. And the description read, "Often travels with a woman believed to be his wife, Geneva, and a female infant." The world tilted on its axis. Geneva Finch, his Geneva. The woman in his home, in his bed, the woman whose hand he'd held on the porch, the woman who was, at this very moment, alone and unprotected at his homestead. Every lie she'd ever told him clicked into place. Her husband hadn't died in a saloon fight. He was a killer, a robber, and she was his accomplice. The silver rattle, her fear of strangers, her rehearsed stories. It all made a sickening kind of sense. He felt a white-hot flash of fury followed by a wave of cold, crushing betrayal. He had taken in a viper. He had let a wolf into his home to sleep beside his hearth. He ripped the poster from the board, his hands shaking. He crumpled it into a ball in his fist. All he could think about was getting back. He rode through the night, not stopping to rest, his mind a maelstrom of questions. Was she a willing partner in these crimes? Was she a victim? And the baby? Hope? Was she even her daughter? Or was she just another piece of the loot stolen from the wreckage of that stagecoach? He arrived back at the homestead just as the sun was beginning to bleed over the horizon. The house was dark and silent. Too silent. Panic seized him. He threw himself from the horse before it even stopped, his boots hitting the ground hard. He ran to the door, his heart hammering against his ribs. It was barred from the inside. He pounded on the wood, shouting her name. "Geneva! Open the door!" He heard a frantic scrambling from within, then the heavy sound of the bar being lifted. The door creaked open, and she stood there, silhouetted against the dim interior. She was holding the shotgun, her knuckles white. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. "Sawyer, you're back! I thought—" She stopped when she saw his face. She saw the rage, the heartbreak, the accusation in his eyes. He pushed past her into the house, his whole body trembling. He walked to the center of the room and turned to face her. He opened his clenched fist and threw the crumpled wanted poster onto the small wooden table between them. It landed with a soft, damning thud. "You told me he died in a saloon," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "You lied to me." Geneva stared at the poster, her face draining of all color. The shotgun slipped from her grasp and clattered to the floor. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. The tough, capable woman he knew was gone, replaced by someone small and broken and utterly terrified. "He's not dead," she whispered, her voice choked with a sound that was half sob, half scream. "And he knows where I am. He's coming, Sawyer. He's coming for the baby." "The baby? Hope?" Sawyer's eyes darted to the cradle by the fireplace. Is she even yours?" Geneva finally broke. A gut-wrenching sob tore from her throat. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No," she cried. "Her name isn't Hope. It's Lillian Langston, and he's not her father. He's the man who murdered her parents." The confession hung in the air, more shocking than any truth he could have imagined. This wasn't a story about a simple outlaw and his wife. This was something far darker. He had been so wrong about everything. He looked at the crumpled poster on the table, then at the weeping woman in front of him, then at the sleeping baby in the cradle. This wasn't Jedediah Finch's child. This was his prize, his leverage. Geneva sank to her knees, her body shaking with uncontrollable sobs. "I was their servant," she choked out, the story pouring out of her in a torrent of grief and fear. "The Langstons. They were good people. They were on that stagecoach, heading to visit family. They took me with them to help with Lillian." She took a ragged breath. "Finch and his men. They hit us at dusk. It was over so fast. They shot Mr. Langston first, then the driver, Mrs. Langston. She was holding Lillian. She saw what was happening. She pushed her into my arms. She screamed at me. 'Run!' she screamed. 'Save my baby!' Tears streamed down Geneva's face as she relived the horror. So I ran. I ran into the brush, into the dark. I could hear the gunshots. I could hear her screaming my name. Then it stopped. I just kept running. I didn't stop until I couldn't feel my legs anymore." She looked up at him, her eyes pleading. "Finch thinks the Langstons had a fortune hidden with them, gold, jewels. He thinks they told me where it was. He thinks the baby is his key to getting it. That's why he's hunting me. He doesn't want the child. He wants what she represents." Sawyer felt the anger drain out of him, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. He had been a fool, not for trusting her, but for not seeing the truth of her terror. He had been so caught up in his own lonely world that he'd missed the signs of a woman who wasn't running from the law, but from a monster. He walked over and picked up the shotgun from the floor. He checked the load. Then he looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw the fierce, desperate courage that had kept her and this child alive. "You changed her name," he said softly. It wasn't a question. "I had to," she whispered. "I named her Hope, because that's all we had left." He knelt in front of her, his expression grim. "How long? How long until he finds us?" She shook her head, a fresh wave of fear washing over her. "I don't know. I took his horse that night. I rode it until it gave out. Then I walked. I thought I'd lost him, but a man like Finch, he doesn't give up. He has eyes everywhere." Sawyer stood up and walked to the window, peering out at the peaceful morning landscape. But it wasn't peaceful anymore. Every shadow looked menacing. Every rustle of leaves sounded like a footstep. His little homestead, his sanctuary, had become a bullseye on a map. "He won't take her, Geneva," he said, his voice low and steady. "He'll have to come through me first." She looked at him, her tear-filled eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and a fragile, burgeoning trust. "Why? Why would you do that for us? I lied to you." He turned from the window to face her. "You did what you had to do to survive, to protect that child. That's not a crime in my book." He walked over to a small, dusty chest in the corner of the room, a chest he hadn't opened in years. He lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were 2 Colt revolvers and a Sharps rifle, the tools of his past life, a life he had tried to bury. "My brother and I," he said, his back to her, "we weren't just farmers' sons. We were scouts for the army. We learned how to track, how to fight, how to disappear. I've tried to forget all that. But I guess some things you never really leave behind." He turned back to her, a revolver in his hand. "You're not alone in this fight." The next few days were a blur of tense preparation. The quiet rhythm of their life was replaced by a frantic, focused energy. Sawyer worked tirelessly, reinforcing the doors, boarding up the back windows, creating firing positions. He wasn't just a farmer anymore. He was a soldier fortifying his position. He took Geneva out behind the barn and taught her how to shoot, not just the shotgun, but the revolver. At first, her hands trembled, the weight of the gun unnatural in her grasp. But as he stood behind her, his hands guiding hers, showing her how to stand, how to breathe, how to squeeze the trigger, a change came over her. The fear in her eyes was replaced by a cold, hard determination. She was a fast learner. Her aim became steady, her movements sure. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a defender. In the evenings, they would sit in the dim light of the cabin, the silence thick with unspoken fears. They talked about Finch, about his habits, his cruelty, the men who rode with him. Sawyer listened to every detail, forming a plan in his mind, a grim calculus of survival. The bond between them deepened, forged in the heat of their shared crisis. The lies had been stripped away, and what was left was a raw, honest connection. He saw the incredible strength in her, and she saw the unwavering protector in him. One night, as they sat by the fire, little Lillian sleeping peacefully in her cradle, Geneva reached out and touched his hand. "Sawyer," she said, her voice barely a whisper, if we don't make it through this, I want you to know—" "We'll make it," he said, his voice firm, cutting her off. He squeezed her hand. "We will." But even as he said the words, he knew the odds were against them. Finch would bring his whole gang. It would be 4 or 5 men against 1 man and a woman who had only just learned how to shoot. The calm before the storm was the most unnerving part. Every sunrise felt like a reprieve, every sunset a threat. They started sleeping in shifts, one of them always awake, always watching. The homestead, once a place of peace, now felt like a cage. And then, one afternoon it happened. Sawyer was on the roof, scanning the horizon when he saw it. A plume of dust in the distance. Too much dust for a single rider. He scrambled down the ladder, his face grim. "They're here," he said, his voice low and urgent as he entered the cabin. Geneva, who was feeding Lillian, looked up, her face instantly pale. She didn't panic. She simply handed him the baby, stood up, and strapped on the revolver he had given her. She was ready. Sawyer placed the sleeping child in a small fortified crate in the root cellar, a place he hoped would be safe from the chaos to come. He looked at Geneva, at the terror and resolve warring in her eyes. He cupped her face in his hands. "Stay away from the windows. Do exactly as I told you. We can do this." She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. He gave her one last hard look, and then he went outside to meet their fate. There were 5 of them. They rode into his yard slow and arrogant, their horses fanning out in a semicircle. The man in the middle was Jedediah Finch. He was just like his poster, cold, cruel, with eyes like chips of ice. He dismounted, a confident smirk on his face, and swaggered toward the house. "Whitlow!" he yelled, his voice echoing in the sudden silence. "I know she's in there. Send her out and we'll be on our way. You've got no part in this." Sawyer stepped out onto the porch, the Sharp's rifle held loosely in his hands. "This is my land, Finch. You're the one who has no part here. Turn around and ride away." Finch laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "I'm not leaving without my property. The woman, and the brat, and the map I know she has." "There's no map," Sawyer said, his voice even. "And the only thing you'll be leaving with is a belly full of lead if you take one more step." The smirk on Finch's face vanished, replaced by a snarl. He gestured to his men. "Burn it down." The world erupted into chaos. Gunshots shattered the quiet air. The windows of the house exploded inwards. Sawyer fired the Sharps, the powerful rifle kicking against his shoulder. One of Finch's men screamed and tumbled from his horse. 4 to go. He ducked back behind the cover of the porch as bullets splintered the wood around him. Inside, Geneva was a blur of motion. She moved to the side window, the position they had planned, and fired the shotgun through the opening. Another rider cried out, clutching his arm. Now it was 3 on 2. Finch and his remaining men took cover behind the wagon and the water trough, laying down a hail of suppressing fire. Sawyer knew they couldn't stay pinned down. He had to change the dynamic. "Geneva! The barn! Now!" he yelled. It was their riskiest gambit. Under the cover of his rifle fire, she was to sneak out the back and make a run for the barn. From there, she would have a clear angle on their flank. He laid down a volley of shots toward the wagon, forcing them to keep their heads down. He saw a flash of movement as Geneva slipped out the back door and sprinted across the open ground. It was the longest 10 seconds of his life. One of Finch's men saw her. He stood up, taking aim, but he was too slow. Sawyer's rifle cracked, and the man fell backward, his shot going wild. Finch roared in frustration. He was now down to 1 man. He and his last remaining goon charged the house, firing wildly. Sawyer took a bullet in the shoulder, the impact spinning him around and sending a searing pain through his body. He staggered, but he didn't fall. He raised his revolver and fired, taking down the last of Finch's men just as he reached the porch steps. Now it was just him and Finch. Finch was at the corner of the house, reloading. Sawyer was on the porch, his left arm useless, blood soaking his shirt. He knew he only had 1 or 2 shots left in his own revolver. "It's over, Finch," he yelled, his voice strained. "Give it up." "Not until I get what I came for," Finch screamed back. He lunged from around the corner, his gun blazing. Sawyer threw himself to the side, a bullet whistling past his ear. He landed hard, his head cracking against a porch post. His vision swam. Finch stood over him, a triumphant, demonic grin on his face. He raised his pistol, aiming it directly at Sawyer's head. "You should have minded your own business, farmer." A deafening blast echoed from the direction of the barn. Finch's eyes went wide with shock. A dark red stain blossomed on his chest. He looked down at it in confusion, then his legs buckled and he collapsed in a heap on the dusty ground. Sawyer pushed himself up, his head spinning. He looked toward the barn. Geneva was standing in the open doorway, the shotgun still smoking in her hands. Her face was a mask of grim determination. She had saved his life. It was over. The silence that descended was absolute, broken only by the whimpering of an injured horse and the buzzing of flies. Sawyer staggered to his feet, clutching his bleeding shoulder. Geneva ran to him, dropping the shotgun and throwing her arms around him. They just stood there for a moment, holding on to each other amidst the carnage, the smell of gunpowder thick in the air. Later, after he'd bandaged his wound and they had dealt with the grim aftermath, they went to the root cellar. Sawyer lifted the lid. Little Lillian was wide awake, her big blue eyes staring up at them, unafraid. She hadn't cried through the whole ordeal. Geneva lifted her out, pressing her face into the child's soft hair, her body shaking with relief. They had won. They had survived. In the weeks that followed, they pieced their lives back together. The house was riddled with bullet holes, a constant reminder of the battle they had fought. But it was their home. They had defended it. They had earned it. Sawyer sent word to the sheriff in Fredericksburg about what had happened. A few days later, a posse rode out. They took statements, collected the bodies, and confirmed that the bounty on Jedediah Finch was indeed his. But Sawyer didn't care about the money. A few months after that, a carriage arrived, a fine, polished carriage that looked utterly out of place in their dusty yard. An elderly, well-dressed couple stepped out. They were the Langstons, Lillian's grandparents. They had been notified by the sheriff, had traveled for weeks, clinging to a sliver of hope. The reunion was heartbreaking and beautiful. They wept as they held their granddaughter, the last piece of their lost son and his wife. They offered Sawyer and Geneva a fortune, anything they wanted, as a reward for saving her. Sawyer refused the money. "Keeping her safe was the only reward we needed," he said. The Langstons stayed for a week, getting to know the couple who had saved their family line. They saw the bullet holes in the walls. They saw the simple, honest life Sawyer and Geneva were building. They saw the way Lillian looked at them, with a love and trust that had been nurtured in the face of terror. On the day they were set to leave, Mrs. Langston made them an offer that stunned them. "We are old," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We can give Lillian a life of wealth and comfort, but we cannot give her this." She gestured around at the small homestead. "We cannot give her the love of a mother who ran through fire for her, or a father who stood against an army to protect her. We want her to have that. We want you to raise her as your own." And so they did. They adopted Lillian legally, and she became Lillian Hope Whitlow. The quiet life they had dreamed of finally began. They rebuilt the house, expanded the garden, and filled the quiet spaces with the sound of a child's laughter. The land healed, and so did they. Sawyer finally took his mother's ring from its hiding place behind the barn and placed it on Geneva's finger. They weren't two strangers who had met on a trail anymore. They were a family forged in violence, bound by courage, and built on a foundation of unshakable love. They had faced the monster from the past and won, proving that sometimes the most important thing you can do is turn your horse around and face the trouble you were trying to ride away from. If you enjoyed this story of courage and justice, and you believe that home is something you fight for, then do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. You never know what other hidden stories we might uncover.